Good morning, everybody, and we do have a dream here at Peachtree this year, and that is to put a Bible in every hand and God's story in every heart. And so if you would, reach for the Bible that's located in the pew rack in front of you or the one that you've brought with you, and turn with me to Mark chapter 5. What we're doing as we go through this series in the year is that we've been exploring the whole story of God, and we're doing that together. We've been walking through the Bible in a year. And as we got into the month of August, we got into the New Testament. Let me share with you this roadmap where we saw the Old Testament over those months leading up to August, and we are now in that period of time where we are looking at the ministry of Jesus. We are looking at his teaching and his earthly ministry, his healing ministry, and we are doing this understanding that as we walk through, particularly the passages in the book of Mark, that we're seeing Jesus now as a figure who has authority. And what we noticed when we first started this is that Jesus has authority over sin, and then we noticed that Jesus has authority over nature and creation. And now in today's passage, we are seeing that Jesus is going to have authority over evil itself. And so we're going to be looking at a dark and disturbing story this morning. And I need to begin, before we read the text, by telling you a quick story. Back when my wife and I were in graduate school at seminary together, when we were there, we were both a part of something that was called the touring choir. It was a small chamber choir of about 12 to 16 singers, and every week we would go to a different congregation. Because our seminary was in New Jersey, most of the time we went to different Presbyterian churches that were kind of scattered around New Jersey. I remember us going to this particular church. It's one of the oldest church buildings in New Jersey. Tiny little church that I think our choir tripled the congregation that day. And then there are other times we went to larger churches like this congregation here. This is the Brick Presbyterian Church in Manhattan in New York City. And I remember the story of the time when the choir was going to Brick Presbyterian Church. There was a young woman in our choir, because Princeton Seminary had people from all over the world in it. There was a woman in our choir who was from Ghana, and she had never been to New York City before. She had seen pictures, she had seen from movies, she had heard about New York, but as the minibus took us into New York City, she became more and more afraid. And as the doors opened for us to walk out to this historic Brick Presbyterian Church, it was where Mark Twain's funeral was. And I mean, we're all excited to get to sing in this vibrant congregation. We all get out of the bus except for her. And my wife is trying to coax her off of the bus, and there was only one word that this woman from Ghana would say. She kept saying, kind of under her breath, Babylon. Babylon. Babylon is that great evil empire from the Old Testament that enslaved and took God's people away in the exile. And as she saw New York City with her eyes, all she saw was Babylon, that this place was dark and evil and that there was something wrong with it. She's not wrong, is she? And she didn't want to get off of the bus. Now, the reason I tell you that story is because what we're about to encounter in today's story is that the disciples, they're not going to get off of a bus, but they're about to get out of a boat. And they don't want to get out of the boat because they're going to this location. I want to show you a map of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is about to take his followers, his disciples, out of Israel for the first time. And they're about to go to that eastern shore where it says Kersey right there, where the orange arrow comes down to that right-hand side of the Sea of Galilee. This is them going outside the comfort of home and into this foreign, dark, and pagan place. And those disciples, they're not going to want to get off of the minibus. Mark chapter 5, starting in the first verse. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes, And when Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he had tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him, and night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. Here we have at the beginning of this story a frightening figure. Someone who comes running down out of this scary area to meet the boat. And Jesus is the only one who has the courage to get out of that boat when they see this man. A couple of years ago, a small group of us from this church, there were a group of couples, we all went to Savannah, Georgia for kind of a long weekend. I had never been to Savannah before, and so we woke up on the weekend and I said, what are we going to do today? What are we going to see? What are we going to explore? And they're like, we're going to go to the cemetery. I'm like, we're going to go do what? And they're like, we're going to go to the cemetery. Because you see, apparently the cemetery in Savannah, as you can see from these pictures, is quite hauntingly beautiful. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of interesting historical markers to be able to explore. I got to tell you, this was not what I had in mind for a Saturday late morning. I was thinking more brunch. You see, when you're a pastor, you go to cemeteries more than average people do. And cemeteries are places of grief. They're places of sadness. They're places of loss. Not the kind of thing that I have a tendency to want to put on my to-do list from a historical marker standpoint. What you need to know is that in the ancient world, cemeteries were not tourist stops, and they certainly weren't places of interest, and they weren't even merely places of grief. They were places of darkness and contamination and fear. Interestingly enough, today, the very story that we're reading about today, we know where it was. It's actually a tourist stop today. It is a national park. It is known as the Kersey National Park. There are ruins from the ancient world there, and you can see those hillsides up there. And the side there are caves that they have found up in there. Many of those caves have the markings and the things inside them that we know that they were used long ago as tombs. This is where the Gerasene demoniac man lived. But he did not live there of his own volition. I don't know if you noticed in the story that he was chained there, that they tied him up, they tried to lock him up, they tried to keep him away. Actually, the verb that the text uses is that they try to subdue him, which is a verb that you would use in conjunction with a wild animal. Here is society trying to take a person and to push him not just to the edges, but to shove him into the darkness of the tombs. And he's like a wild person living there, and he's uncontainable. And Jesus and the boat, and Jesus gets out of the boat, and this man comes running right for them. Let's look at verse 6. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." And then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. One of the things that's going to happen for you as you go on this reading journey with us through the New Testament, one of the things that you will discover, and you will be surprised because we're not trying to curate what we read as much as be able to see the full scope of what's there, is that you're going to be surprised again and again by that one of the things that comes up in Jesus' ministry are people who are dealing with the dark spiritual forces of this world, with demons. And so I feel like I need to pause for a moment as we read this story and really ask the question, really, haven't we moved past this? Like, isn't this just a misunderstanding of psychology and the limitation of what they knew in that day and age? But today we know better, and that what they might have called demon possession or any of these dark spiritual forces was just really of a misunderstanding of the human psyche. I'm afraid not. You see, if you were to take everything in our society that we think is good, if you were to take healthcare and you were to make it that much better, if you were to take education and you were to make it that much better, if you were to take economics and our financial situation and you were to make it that much better, and if you were to take psychology and you were to make it that much better, in fact, if you were to be able to perfect all of these different dimensions of our lives, I am here to tell you that as we continually approve those things and improve those things, we will still not solve all that is wrong and broken and dark in this world. Because there is more that is fundamentally wrong with us than just a lack of education or a lack of health care or a lack of economics or money. There is more going on, my friends, than we can see with our eyes. That something is spiritually askew within our own hearts and within this world. C.S. Lewis says that one of the things that we need to do is to understand when it comes to reading about these forces and demons in the New Testament and thinking about them in our lives, there's two mistakes that we can make. One mistake is to pretend that we're so sophisticated that these things don't exist anymore and that they don't matter. And the equal and opposite mistake that we can make is that we can become unhealthily fascinated in them. People often ask me, they will say, "Do you believe in demons?" I say, "No, I believe in Jesus Christ, but I do believe that there are dark spiritual forces in this world. As your pastor, I have encountered them personally within the congregations that I have served. And one of the things that we need to do in terms of this being important for understanding this story today is that if we just have the over-psychological view of what happens in the New Testament, we will fail to see the extent to Jesus coming to do what he came to do, and that is this: Jesus did not just come to manage our problems, he came to conquer evil. I love how C.S. Lewis puts it. He puts it like this. A member from the congregation sent this to me this week. I love having a research team. You guys keep sending me the good stuff. Don't send me the complaints, though. Enemy-occupied territory. That is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say landed in disguise, and is calling all of us to take part in the great campaign of sabotage. We are a part of the divine conspiracy of God's goodness in the world that will overtake the forces of evil. And let's see how Jesus does this and continue in the story in verse 11. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." And he gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. And the herd of about 2,000 in number rushed down the steep bank and into the lake and were drowned. Does anybody have any questions? I remember we were having breakfast. We were a family with young kids, and one of our daughters held up a strip of bacon at breakfast and said, "Mama, is bacon pig?" And Kelly just sighed because she knew, our kids loved animal. There's Wilbur, there's all the different, there's Babe from the cartoon, there's all these lovable pigs. And Kelly said, yes, bacon is pig. And our daughter said, "Pig is good." That's when I knew that our work as parents were done. That was all the gospel that she needed to hear. This is a strange story because you go from dealing with this man who is possessed by evil forces and consumed by them to all of a sudden Jesus is casting those demons out into the pigs, and the pigs run off and they jump off a cliff and into the water. What on earth is going on here? Well, I need to teach you a phrase, and I want you to say it with me. We're going to put it on the bottom of the screen. Evil only exists as a corruption of the good. Say that with me. Evil only exists as a corruption for the good. I need to get a little philosophical with you for a moment here, so bear with me. Darkness only exists as the absence or the shadow of light. There is no true darkness except for that absence or the covering it up. There isn't any evil that exists in this world that is independent of the host of something that it is trying to corrupt. In other words, murder is the corruption of what is the good gift that is life. Lying is the corruption of the good gift of what we call the truth. Adultery is the corruption of the good gift of what is supposed to be marriage. Over and over again, you can think of all the different things that we have that are good gifts and how those things can get warped, how those things can get corrupted, how those things can get manipulated to become the evil version of what they were supposed to be. And so as Jesus is going to deal with evil, he is going to cast it out. It is not the man who is evil. It is what needs to be removed from him. Now, depending on your perspective of pigs in the ancient world, a good Jew hearing this story probably would have laughed because pigs were seen as the lowliest and the dirtiest and the uncleanest of animals. In fact, we know, again, where this story took place. These are the cliffs of the Gerasene right next to Kersey Park. This is where the cliffs fall and roll down into the sea. And I know that PETA didn't sponsor today's miracle, but even in the ancient world, for the residents who were living there, imagine thousands and thousands of pigs lost. This wasn't funny for them either. Let's keep reading in verse 14. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there dressed and what? In his right mind. And they were afraid. Do you remember how last week when we went through the story of Jesus and the disciples in the boat in the big storm, and how when the storm kicked up that the disciples were afraid, and then Jesus calms the storm, and then it says they were greatly afraid, or they were really, really afraid? And that there's good kinds of fear and that there's bad kind of fear. This was only last week. Nod your head if you actually remember last week's message, okay? Humor me at least. What we see in this story is that they are afraid of this man, and so they try to chain him up, to treat him like an animal, to push him, to try to push the forces of darkness and to contain them in the tombs because they're afraid. And now this man is sitting there in his right mind. And what's their response? They're even more scared. You will be scared when you see and you experience something that you cannot explain and you encounter the dark spiritual forces of this realm. You know what scares us more? Transformation that we can't account for. Here's how one New Testament scholar, he puts it like this. Instead of giving him the key to the city, they give him the cold shoulder. The demons had begged Jesus to let them stay in the region, and the townspeople now beg Jesus to leave the region. They are more comfortable with the malevolent forces that take captive human beings and destroy animals than they are with the one who can expel them. They can cope with the odd demon-possessed wild man who terrorizes the neighborhood with random acts of violence, but they want to keep someone with Jesus' power at lake's length on the other side. They chase off the source of their deliverance and salvation. And so what do? Here is someone who has come with this incredible healing power. And instead of rejoicing, they ask Jesus to leave. My friends, I know people who have encountered Jesus and become afraid and pushed him further away. And here's how Jesus responds to that. Verse 18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And so the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis, which is the 10 cities, how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Jesus does the most un-Jesus-like thing in this part of the story. At first, there are the demons that beg to not be destroyed, and Jesus says yes to their request. And then there's the townspeople who beg Jesus to leave, and Jesus says yes to their request. And now here you have this man who begs Jesus that he might follow. What has Jesus been doing early on in his ministry? He's been pointing to the signs of the kingdom and all the different aspects of the way that God's kingdom and heaven are breaking into this world with all the different dimensions of healing and the authority that he has over the false authorities of this world. And he has been gathering followers by saying, "Follow me, follow me, follow me." And here is a man who has experienced his transformation and his power. And he says, "Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. Can I go with you?" And Jesus says, no. Make sense of that. But he doesn't just say no. He says no, and then he gives him a mission. He says, "No. Go home." This congregation is quite familiar with this man, Louis Zamperini. He came to speak at this church as well as my church in Southern California. You probably know his story well from the book or the movie. The first season of his life, he becomes an Olympic runner. In the second season of his life, he becomes a part of our effort in World War II in the Pacific Theater. He ends up, his plane is downed. He has this incredible survival story at sea, and then an even more harrowing survival story in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Eventually, beyond all odds, he makes it back to the United States. And you would think that at this point, his life would be easier. Think of all the things that he's had to go through: the training, the warfare, the physical hardship, the mental torture. The hardest thing he ever faced, the biggest demons that he had to confront, were in his own home. I asked him about it. Hardest thing he ever did in his life. was go home. The most difficult mission field for any person is in their own house, their own apartment. In some regards, it would be easier to pick up everything that you have and go to a different continent to follow Jesus. Because the people who are closest to you, they see you at your best, they see you at your worst. Try taking marriage to your family, the gospel into your marriage, into your home. It's the toughest missions field of all. And so today I want you to hear the strange rejection of Jesus. To go out and to do something somewhere else. And to hear him say to you, go back to your home. Go back to your home. And the question is, does the authority of Jesus even extend over evil and into the brokenness of our own relationships and our own houses? I know that it does, but it will be the hardest thing you ever tackle. Go to your home and let's pray. Lord, that was a dark and frightening place for the disciples to go. And yet when they got there, they saw something that they couldn't believe that was possible, your authority even over the forces of darkness. Lord, you were not afraid to go to the creepy place, the place of grief and contamination, not as a tourist stop, not as a park, but to be able to unbind that which we try to subdue. Lord, help us to not be fixated on the dark forces of this world, but also help us to not be naive and to think that there's not more than beyond what our systems and eyes can see. And so, God, may we be a part of the goodness that you are doing in the world. May our own souls and families and lives not become corrupted by the forces that would threaten to undo us. May we not be like the townspeople who beg you to leave. And may you tell us clearly to be sent into our own houses, equipped only with the gospel of the good news of what you are doing and what your kingdom can accomplish. Deliver us not, God, from just a lack of health care and education. Deliver us from evil. Invade our own homes, God. And this we pray in Jesus' name.